Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Imagine you've just woken up in a world without modern maps or quick travel. No alarm clock, no coffee, just the cold reality of muddy roads, wooden ploughs, and kings who spoke French at court even when ruling England. The year is around 1328, when the French King Charles IV dies without a son to follow him. The French nobles choose his cousin Philip of Valois as the new king, Philip VI. Across the Channel in England, a young king named Edward III watches this closely. Edward's mother is the sister of the dead French king, which gives him a blood claim to the throne through his female line. The French, however, prefer to keep the crown among men who have always lived on French soil and follow their own customs of succession. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I enjoy seeing where you are listening from. Post your location and your local time in the comments below. It is a quiet reminder that history connects people across centuries and across continents. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the early 14th century, the Kingdom of France stood as one of the most powerful realms in Europe. Its lands were fertile, its population large, and its monarchy deeply rooted in tradition. For generations, the Capetian kings had passed the crown directly from father to son. The continuity created stability. Authority felt secure. Few imagined that this long line would suddenly come to an end. In 1314, King Philip IV of France died. Within 14 years, all three of his sons, Louis X, Philip V and Charles IV, would also die, each leaving no surviving male heir. The deaths came in succession, close enough in time to unsettle the nobility. The direct male line of the Capetian dynasty had quietly ended. At first, the problem appeared technical. France had daughters and sisters of kings, and it had cousins through female lines. But French custom, later referred to as Salic law, discouraged inheritance of the crown through women. It was not yet a fixed written statute, but it was a principle many powerful nobles preferred. They feared that allowing inheritance through a woman might place the kingdom under foreign influence. Across the Channel, the young King of England, Edward III, watched events carefully. His mother, Isabella of France, was the daughter of Philip IV. Through her, Edward believed he held a strong claim to the French throne. By blood, he was a grandson of Philip IV. In simple lineage, his claim was closer than that of many French nobles, yet the French aristocracy chose a different path. In 1328, they crowned Philip of Valois as King Philip VI of France. He was a cousin of the late king, descended through the male line. His accession reinforced the idea that the crown must pass through men alone. The choice was political as much as legal. The French nobles did not wish to see an English king rule them. At first, Edward III did not openly contest the decision. England and France were already entangled in complex feudal ties. The English kings held lands in southwestern France, particularly the Duchy of Aquitaine, as vassals to the French crown. This meant that the King of England owed homage to the King of France for those territories. It was an arrangement that had caused tension for generations. Edward travelled to France in 1329 to pay homage to Philip VI. The ceremony appeared respectful, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. The English king bowed to a monarch he believed should be his equal, or perhaps even subordinate to his own claim. The situation left room for resentment. Meanwhile, both kingdoms faced economic and political strain. Europe in the early 14th century was not peaceful. Trade networks were expanding, but harvest failures and regional conflicts placed pressure on populations. Nobles depended on warfare to assert influence and gain prestige. Kings relied on loyalty that could shift quickly. Philip VI sought to strengthen his authority and assert control over rebellious territories. One of those territories was Gascony, part of Aquitaine, held by Edward III. Disputes over jurisdiction and sovereignty soon resurfaced. French officials attempted to limit English autonomy in the region. Edward resisted. By 1337, Philip VI made a decisive move. He declared that Edward had failed in his duties as a vassal and confiscated the Duchy of Aquitaine. This act struck at the heart of English economic interests. Gascony was not merely land, it was a source of valuable wine exports and trade revenue. Losing it meant losing wealth and prestige. Edward responded in a way that altered European history. He formally claimed the French crown for himself. No longer content with diplomatic manoeuvring, he declared that Philip VI was not the rightful king of France. The dispute over feudal rights transformed into a broader dynastic war. This claim was not made lightly. Edward's advisors understood the risk. France was larger and more populous than England. Its resources were considerable. Yet Edward also recognized that alliances could shift the balance. He secured support from the Low Countries, particularly Flanders, whose economy depended heavily on English wool. Economic interests often shaped political loyalty. The early years of the conflict did not resemble a continuous war in the modern sense. Instead, they unfolded as a series of campaigns, raids, and naval engagements. In 1340, the English fleet defeated the French navy at the Battle of Sluys. Control of the Channel allowed England to transport troops more safely. The victory signalled that the conflict would not remain confined to diplomacy. As Edward pressed his claim, the nature of kingship itself began to change. Both monarchs required unprecedented levels of taxation to fund their armies. Parliaments and representative assemblies gained greater influence because kings needed consent to raise revenue. The war quietly strengthened institutions that would later shape national governance. Within France, Philip VI worked to maintain unity among powerful regional lords. Loyalty was essential, but it was not guaranteed. Feudal obligations could be fragile. Some nobles calculated where their interests lay before committing troops. The war required coordination across vast territories, and communication moved slowly. In England, Edward III cultivated an image of chivalry and martial leadership. He revived interest in Arthurian legend and founded the Order of the Garter. These gestures reinforced his legitimacy and inspired loyalty among the nobility. War was not only about territory, it was also about perception and honour. By the early 1340s, it had become clear that neither side would quickly abandon its position. The dispute over succession had grown into something larger. Merchants felt the impact of disrupted trade. Villages experienced the passing of armies. Coastal communities feared raids. Ordinary people who had no voice in royal councils would carry much of the burden. The conflict would eventually last more than a century, though those living in 1337 could not yet see its full extent. They experienced it as an immediate crisis shaped by pride, inheritance, and competing visions of authority. The struggle began with a question of legitimacy, but it would soon expand into battles that redefined military practice and national identity. At its heart, the opening phase of the 100 Years' War was not inevitable. It emerged from a combination of dynastic uncertainty, economic rivalry, and political ambition. The death of a king without a son created an opening. Decisions made by nobles hardened into principle. Pride transformed disagreement into confrontation. As Edward III prepared his campaigns, Europe watched. Alliances were negotiated. Armies gathered. The Channel, once simply a stretch of water between neighbours, became a strategic frontier. The stage was set for clashes that would shape both kingdoms in ways neither could fully anticipate. The war did not begin with a single dramatic moment, but with a series of deliberate steps. Each decision narrowed the path back to peace. Each assertion of right deepened the divide. By the time swords were drawn in earnest, the political arguments had already reshaped the relationship between England and France. In the quiet before the first major land battles, the outlines of a long conflict had already formed. Two kings claimed legitimacy. Two courts mobilized resources. and two peoples began to understand themselves not merely as neighbouring realms, but as rivals in a contest that would extend beyond a generation. When open war finally came, it did not arrive as a sudden storm. It unfolded through calculated movements, shifting alliances, and a steady tightening of resolve. Edward III had declared his claim to the French crown, but a declaration alone did not win kingdoms. It required ships, soldiers, coin, and patience. In 1338, Edward crossed to the continent to build support among the princes of the Low Countries and the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire. These regions were not united under a single authority, and many towns depended economically on English wool for their textile industries. Edward understood this dependency and used it carefully. By presenting himself not only as a claimant to France but as a reliable economic partner, he secured financial and military backing. War in the 14th century often depended as much on trade agreements as on battlefield courage. The French king, Philip VI, worked just as steadily to counter these efforts. He relied on the traditional strength of France, its larger population and its established network of feudal levies. French nobles were expected to provide mounted knights when called. The French cavalry, heavily armoured and confident in its chivalric traditions, had long been regarded as among the finest in Europe. Philip trusted in this structure and in the prestige of the French monarchy. One of the earliest major engagements of the war occurred at sea. In June 1340, off the coast near Sluys, the English fleet met the French navy. Control of the channel was essential. Without it, Edward could not safely move troops to the continent. The French ships were anchored in tight formation, creating what they believed to be a defensive barrier. Edward's fleet attacked aggressively, boarding ships and turning the engagement into close combat. The English emerged victorious. The defeat weakened French naval power and gave England greater freedom to transport forces across the water. Even so, war did not become constant campaigning. Financial strain slowed both sides. Edward had borrowed heavily to fund his alliances and military operations. When expected revenues did not arrive quickly enough, he faced debt and domestic criticism. The English Parliament, which approved taxation, gained leverage. War forced the king to negotiate internally as well as externally. In the early 1340s, campaigns in northern France and along the Flemish frontier produced mixed results. There were sieges, skirmishes and raids designed to weaken local economies. The English often employed a tactic later known as the chevauchée, a mounted raid through enemy territory intended to destroy crops, burn villages, and undermine confidence in the opposing king's protection. These raids were not large territorial conquests. Instead, they were calculated demonstrations of reach and disruption. Philip VI struggled with a different challenge. The French crown was powerful, but it was not absolute. Regional lords guarded their autonomy. Mobilizing them required negotiation. Some nobles were hesitant to commit resources to prolonged campaigns, especially when the English avoided direct confrontation and instead damaged the countryside. Maintaining unity became as important as defeating Edward's armies. By 1345, Edward III had regained momentum. He launched coordinated campaigns in Gascony, Brittany, and Normandy. English forces achieved victories in southwestern France, where local support sometimes favoured English governance due to long-standing commercial ties. Gascony, in particular, had been linked to England for generations, and many inhabitants viewed English rule as predictable and commercially beneficial. In 1346, Edward led one of his most significant expeditions. He landed in Normandy with a substantial army and began a sweeping march across northern France. The movement was deliberate and destructive. Towns were looted, estates damaged, and supplies taken. The objective was not only to gather wealth, but to draw the French king into open battle. Philip VI assembled a large army to confront him. French confidence rested heavily on mounted knights trained for direct charges. Chivalric culture valued personal bravery and decisive engagement. The English army, however, had developed a different structure. It relied on disciplined infantry formations supported by large numbers of longbowmen. The English longbow, requiring years of training, could send arrows with considerable force and speed. It was not new, but its systematic use would soon prove decisive. As the two armies manoeuvred in late summer of 1346, Edward chose his ground carefully near the village of Crécy. He positioned his forces on a slight rise, placing archers along the flanks and infantry in the centre. Defensive preparation was deliberate. Stakes were driven into the ground to disrupt cavalry charges. The English waited. Philip VI arrived with a numerically superior force, but coordination faltered. The French army included not only knights but also Genoese crossbowmen. Rain had fallen earlier, affecting the crossbow's strings. The English longbowmen, accustomed to protecting their equipment, were ready. When battle began, English arrows fell rapidly and in large numbers. French cavalry charges followed, but they met disciplined resistance and sustained volleys of arrows. Horses fell, formations broke. Confusion spread. The battlefield became disordered. By the end of the day, French losses were severe. Among the dead were high-ranking nobles whose absence would affect French politics for years. The Battle of Crécy did not end the war, but it altered perceptions. The traditional dominance of mounted knights had been challenged. Infantry and missile troops, properly positioned, could withstand and defeat heavily armoured cavalry. Military organisation began to shift gradually across Europe. Following the victory at Crécy, Edward advanced to Calais. The port city was strategically important. It offered a gateway between England and continental Europe. Rather than storming the city immediately, Edward laid siege. The siege lasted nearly a year. Supplies dwindled inside the walls. Starvation and disease became pressing concerns for the inhabitants. Philip VI attempted to relieve the city, but could not force the English to withdraw. In 1347, Calais surrendered. Edward expelled much of the local population and replaced them with English settlers. Calais would remain under English control for more than 2 centuries. Its capture provided England with a permanent foothold on French soil. Yet even as England celebrated its gains, a far more devastating force approached Europe. In 1347 and 1348, the Black Death began to spread across the continent. Carried by trade routes, the plague moved through ports and into inland towns. It did not distinguish between peasant and noble. Mortality rates were staggering. Entire communities were altered within months. The war paused, not because peace had been negotiated, but because society itself was under strain. Armies could not function normally when populations were declining and fear was widespread. Labour shortages changed economic relationships. Survivors demanded higher wages. Social structures shifted. For Edward III and Philip VI, the plague introduced new uncertainties. Tax bases shrank. Military recruitment became more difficult. Governance required adaptation. The conflict that had begun as a contest over dynastic legitimacy now intersected with demographic crisis. By the early 1350s, Europe was emerging from the first wave of plague, but nothing was quite the same. Fields lay untended in some regions. Trade networks had been disrupted. Political authority was tested by both war and disease. Yet neither England nor France abandoned its claims. The early phase of the 100 Years' War had established patterns that would endure. England relied on mobility, disciplined archers, and strategic raids. France relied on manpower and traditional feudal structures. Though lessons from Crécy would not be forgotten, the rivalry hardened into expectation. A generation was growing up for whom conflict between the two kingdoms felt normal. Edward III's assertion of his claim had moved beyond words. Through victories at sea and on land, he demonstrated that England could challenge France directly. Philip VI, though wounded politically, maintained his throne and continued resistance. The struggle was no longer theoretical. It had reshaped coastlines, economies, and military thinking. The coming years would test both kingdoms further. The next major confrontation would bring an even more dramatic outcome. one that placed a king in captivity and forced both sides to reconsider the cost of ambition. In the years following the fall of Calais and the first wave of plague, neither kingdom abandoned its ambitions. The war resumed in phases, shaped by recovery and renewed calculation. Edward III remained determined to press his claim, while France sought to regain stability under a monarchy that had endured defeat but not collapse. By the mid-1350s, the focus of English operations shifted once more towards southwestern France. Gascony had long been an English possession, and from there campaigns could be launched into deeper French territory. Edward's eldest son, Edward of Woodstock, later known as the Black Prince, took on increasing responsibility. He had grown up during the early campaigns and had observed both success and hardship. Now he would command independently. In 1355, the Black Prince led a mounted raid across southern France. The expedition followed the familiar pattern of the chevauchée: rapid movement, destruction of supplies, and pressure on local authority. Towns that resisted were looted, crops were damaged. The aim was to weaken France economically and to demonstrate that the French crown could not shield its lands from English reach. The French king at this time was John II, who had succeeded Philip VI in 1350. John inherited a kingdom under strain. The treasury had been diminished by years of warfare. Nobles expected protection and recognition. The memory of Crécy lingered. John understood that restoring royal prestige required decisive action. In 1356, the Black Prince again advanced northward from Gascony. His forces were not vast, but they were disciplined. English and Gascon troops moved deliberately, gathering supplies and challenging French authority. John II assembled a large army to intercept him. Determined to avoid the mistakes of Crécy, the French prepared for confrontation. The two forces met near the city of Poitiers in September 1356. The English army took up a defensive position, similar in principle to that used a decade earlier. Terrain was chosen carefully. Natural obstacles limited the avenues of attack. Archers were positioned to maximize their range and effect. John II commanded a sizable force, including heavily armored knights and infantry. Unlike at Crécy, the French attempted a more controlled advance. Yet coordination remained difficult. Communication across the field was imperfect, and units did not always move in harmony. When battle began, English longbowmen once again played a critical role. Arrows disrupted formations and unsettled advancing troops. The English infantry held steady. As pressure mounted, the Black Prince committed reserves at key moments. The fighting was intense but methodical rather than chaotic. Leadership and discipline shaped the outcome. By the end of the day, the French army had broken. Most strikingly, King John II was captured. A reigning monarch had fallen into enemy hands on the battlefield. The capture was not merely symbolic. It created a political crisis in France and offered England a powerful bargaining tool. John was treated with the respect expected for a captured king, yet his imprisonment altered the balance of negotiations. He was eventually transported to England, where he remained for several years. His absence left France governed by his son, the Dauphin Charles, who faced a daunting task. The French crown now confronted multiple pressures. The cost of ransom demanded by England was immense. Raising funds required taxation, which strained relations with towns and regional leaders. Discontent grew, particularly in Paris. Merchants and artisans felt the burden. In 1358, unrest erupted in two significant forms. In the countryside, peasants launched what became known as the Jacquerie. The revolt was fueled by frustration with noble demands and the devastation caused by years of war. Castles were attacked, and local authority was challenged. Though the uprising was eventually suppressed, it revealed deep social tension. At the same time, political unrest stirred in Paris under the leadership of Etienne Marcel, a prominent figure in the city's administration. Marcel sought reforms that would limit royal power and increase representation for urban interests. With the king in captivity, negotiations between the crown and the Estates General became complex. Authority appeared uncertain. The Dauphin Charles navigated these challenges cautiously. He worked to restore order while avoiding open fragmentation. His approach contrasted with the more confrontational style of earlier leadership. Gradually, he regained control of Paris and stabilized the monarchy. Meanwhile, Edward III saw opportunity. In 1359, he launched another campaign into northern France, seeking to capitalize on French weakness and secure more favorable terms. Yet warfare was costly on both sides. Armies required payment. Weather and supply difficulties complicated operations. Neither side achieved a decisive breakthrough during this campaign. Negotiations resumed, leading to the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360. The terms were significant. Edward agreed, at least temporarily, to renounce his claim to the French crown in exchange for substantial territorial concessions and a large ransom for King John II. England gained expanded control over Aquitaine and other regions, free from French overlordship. The treaty represented a pause rather than a conclusion. It reflected exhaustion and financial strain as much as reconciliation. For France, the ransom payments were burdensome. For England, holding newly acquired territories required continued vigilance. John II returned to France after his release, but later voluntarily returned to England when one of his sons failed to fulfill ransom conditions. He died in captivity in 1364. His death marked the end of a troubled reign shaped by defeat and internal unrest. His son, now King Charles V, inherited a kingdom altered by hardship. Charles had observed the failures of earlier strategies. He approached the war with patience and calculation. Rather than seeking immediate pitched battles, he emphasized careful planning, financial reform, and rebuilding trust with regional leaders. Under Charles V, France began to recover gradually. Administrative reforms strengthened royal finances. Professional soldiers replaced some reliance on feudal levies. One of Charles's most capable commanders, Bertrand du Guesclin, adopted flexible tactics. Avoiding large confrontations, French forces targeted isolated garrisons and disrupted English supply lines. In contrast, England faced its own challenges. The Black Prince, though victorious at Poitiers, governed Aquitaine with difficulty. Local resistance increased, particularly when heavy taxation was imposed to fund campaigns in Spain. Health problems further limited his effectiveness. By the late 1360s, hostilities resumed despite the Treaty of Bretigny. Charles V methodically reclaimed territories that had been ceded to England. French strategy focused on attrition and endurance. English strongholds fell one by one, often through siege rather than open battle. Edward III, aging and facing domestic concerns, found it increasingly difficult to sustain momentum abroad. Financial strain reappeared. Political tensions simmered within England. The generation that had celebrated Crécy and Poitiers was giving way to one less certain of permanent advantage. As the decade closed, the war had shifted in character. The dramatic capture of a king had given way to slower campaigns of reconquest. Military innovation continued quietly. Administrative structures evolved in response to sustained conflict. Both kingdoms were adapting. The struggle that began with a disputed crown had now produced captured monarchs, popular uprisings, territorial exchanges, and strategic reconsiderations. It had tested the resilience of institutions and the loyalty of subjects, and it had revealed that neither swift victory nor simple settlement would define its course. The later years of Edward III's reign unfolded in a quieter, more uncertain rhythm. The early triumphs at Crécy and Poitiers had brought prestige and territorial gain, yet maintaining those gains required constant effort. As France regrouped under Charles V, the balance began to shift gradually. Charles V did not seek large, dramatic battles. He had studied the defeats suffered by his father and understood the risks of meeting English forces on terms that favoured longbowmen and defensive positioning. Instead, he relied on steady pressure. French commanders retook towns through sieges, negotiation, and calculated manoeuvre. Fortified positions were isolated. Garrisons were starved or persuaded to surrender. Bertrand du Guesclin played a central role in this approach. Appointed Constable of France, he avoided reckless engagement. His methods emphasized patience and local advantage. Rather than charging into arrow fire, French forces learned to exploit terrain and timing. Over time, this strategy recovered much of the territory lost under the Treaty of Bretigny. In England, the strain of prolonged war became more visible. Parliament grew more assertive in questioning the costs of campaigns. Taxation weighed heavily on communities already affected by labour shortages following the plague. Veterans returned home to a society still adjusting to demographic change. Wages had risen, and attempts by the Crown to control them created tension. The Black Prince, once a symbol of English vigour, faced declining health. His expedition into Castile in 1367, though successful in restoring a claimant to the throne there, had drained resources. Funding the campaign required heavy levies in Aquitaine. Local nobles resented these demands and appealed to the French crown for relief. Charles V seized the opportunity to challenge English authority in the region. By the early 1370s, English holdings in France were shrinking. Towns that had once acknowledged Edward's rule returned to French allegiance. The English military remained capable, but coordination across distance was difficult. Supply lines stretched thin. Enthusiasm at home was less certain than in earlier years. Edward III himself aged into a more withdrawn figure. Court politics grew more complicated. Advisors competed for influence. Public confidence was not destroyed, but it was no longer unshaken. The death of the Black Prince in 1376 further altered the succession. Edward's heir was now his grandson, Richard of Bordeaux, still a child. When Edward III died in 1377, the war had entered a new phase. England retained Calais and certain coastal enclaves, but much of the territory gained during earlier campaigns had been lost. France, under Charles V, had restored confidence and stability. Richard II became king at the age of 10. His minority meant that governance fell to councils and influential nobles. External war and internal management overlapped. England faced not only foreign conflict but also social change intensified by the aftermath of plague and taxation. In 1381, a major uprising erupted in England known as the Peasants' Revolt. Though not directly caused by the war, its context cannot be separated from years of financial pressure. A poll tax intended to fund military efforts triggered widespread resistance. Rebels marched toward London, demanding reforms and relief from burdens. Richard II, though young, confronted the crisis directly. The revolt was eventually suppressed, but the episode revealed deeper strains within English society. War had reshaped expectations about authority and obligation. The crown needed revenue, yet subjects increasingly demanded representation and fairness in return. Across the Channel, Charles V died in 1380, leaving the throne to his son Charles VI, who was also young. France now entered its own period of minority rule and regency. Political factions emerged among nobles seeking influence. Stability, though achieved, was not guaranteed. The late 14th century saw intermittent truces and renewed skirmishes. Neither side possessed the resources or unity for sweeping campaigns. Maritime raids occurred along the coasts. Small-scale operations disrupted trade. The war seemed less a single, continuous struggle and more a background condition shaping policy. Gradually, internal developments in France introduced new complications. Charles VI suffered episodes of mental illness beginning in the 1390s. During periods when he was unable to govern, rival factions formed around influential relatives. The Burgundian and Armagnac factions competed for dominance within the royal court. Their rivalry weakened centralized authority. England observed these divisions carefully. Richard II attempted diplomatic engagement, including a marriage alliance with France in 1396. A truce was agreed upon, offering temporary relief, yet Richard's rule at home became increasingly autocratic. His conflicts with powerful nobles led to his eventual deposition in 1399. Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV, claimed the English throne after Richard's removal. The change of dynasty introduced uncertainty. England now faced internal legitimacy questions while still entangled in continental claims. Henry IV focused initially on consolidating his rule and suppressing domestic rebellions. For a time, the war with France receded from centre stage. Both kingdoms confronted internal adjustment, yet underlying claims were not abandoned. English possession of Calais remained a symbol of unresolved rivalry. French factions continued to compete for control of a monarch whose authority fluctuated with his health. By the early 15th century, circumstances would once again align to intensify conflict. In France, factional violence between Burgundians and Armagnacs escalated. In England, Henry IV's son, Henry V, matured into a determined and capable leader. He inherited not only a throne but also a long-standing claim to French sovereignty. The earlier decades of the war had demonstrated that battlefield victories alone could not secure permanent dominance. Political cohesion, financial management, and social stability were equally decisive. As new leaders emerged, they would apply lessons learned from both triumph and setback. The stage was gradually being reset. A divided France and a newly confident English king would soon renew confrontation on terms that echoed earlier campaigns but carried new consequences. The 100 Years' War had not ended. It had simply entered another chapter shaped by generational change and shifting opportunity. When Henry IV died in 1413, his son succeeded him as Henry V. The new king was 26 years old, disciplined and deliberate. Unlike his father, whose reign had been shaped by rebellion and insecurity, Henry V inherited a throne that was more stable. He also inherited a claim to the French crown that had never fully disappeared. France at this moment was deeply divided. King Charles VI remained alive but was frequently incapacitated by mental illness. During his episodes, rival factions governed in his name. The Burgundians, led by John the Fearless and the Armagnacs, aligned with the king's brother and later his son, competed for influence. Their struggle sometimes erupted into open violence in Paris. Royal authority existed, but it was fragmented. Henry V watched carefully. He understood that a divided France presented opportunity. Before turning to war, he sought diplomatic recognition of his claim and territorial demands. Negotiations with the French court were formal but inconclusive. The terms Henry proposed were extensive. When agreement failed, he prepared for invasion. In 1415, Henry crossed the Channel with a substantial army. His first objective was the port of Harfleur in Normandy. The siege lasted several weeks. Disease spread among English troops, and casualties mounted. By the time Harfleur surrendered, Henry's forces were reduced. Many advisers suggested returning to England. Instead, Henry chose to march north toward Calais, the long-held English stronghold. The journey required crossing territory where French forces could intercept him. The French, despite internal divisions, assembled a large army. Nobles from various regions answered the call. The objective was clear: prevent the English from reaching safety. The two armies encountered each other near the village of Agincourt in October 1415. Heavy rain had recently fallen. The ground was soft and narrow between wooded areas. Henry positioned his troops carefully, as Edward III had done decades earlier. Longbowmen formed a crucial component of his line. The French army, larger and heavily armoured, advanced across muddy terrain. Movement was slow. The ground hindered cavalry and compressed formations. English archers released volleys that disrupted momentum. When French forces reached the English line, they were already fatigued and disordered. Close combat followed, but the conditions favoured the defenders. By the end of the day, French losses were severe. Many high-ranking nobles were killed or captured. Henry V's victory at Agincourt became one of the most recognised moments of the war, yet it did not immediately grant him control of France. It demonstrated capacity, not conclusion. After returning briefly to England, Henry launched further campaigns beginning in 1417. This time the objective was systematic conquest rather than a single march. Normandy became the focus. Town after town fell to English forces through siege and negotiation. Discipline and organisation characterised the campaign. Henry established administrative control over captured territories, reinforcing English authority. Meanwhile, French internal conflict intensified. In 1419, John the Fearless was assassinated during a meeting with the Dauphin Charles. The event deepened division. The Burgundian faction, now led by Philip the Good, turned decisively against the Dauphin and aligned with Henry V. The alliance shifted the political landscape. With Burgundian support, Henry advanced his position further. In 1420, negotiations produced the Treaty of Troyes. The agreement recognised Henry V as heir to the French throne and regent during Charles VI's lifetime. It also arranged Henry's marriage to Catherine of Valois, the French king's daughter. The Dauphin Charles was effectively disinherited in the eyes of the treaty's signatories. The treaty did not end resistance, but it altered legitimacy. For the first time, an official French document acknowledged an English king as future ruler of France. Henry had achieved through diplomacy what earlier monarchs had sought primarily through battle. Yet the situation remained fragile. Control on paper did not guarantee obedience across all regions. Supporters of the Dauphin continued to resist. France was not unified under the treaty. Instead, it was partitioned between competing claims. In 1422, events shifted again. Henry V died unexpectedly, likely from illness, at the age of 35. Shortly afterward, Charles VI also died. According to the Treaty of Troyes, the infant son of Henry V and Catherine of Valois, Henry VI, became king of both England and France. He was less than a year old. A dual monarchy now existed in theory. In practice, governance depended on regents. In England, the Duke of Bedford and the Duke of Gloucester assumed leadership roles. In France, English-aligned administrators sought to maintain authority in territories under their control. The Dauphin Charles, however, declared himself rightful king as Charles VII and maintained power in southern regions. The war entered another prolonged phase. English forces controlled much of northern France, including Paris. Burgundian allies strengthened their position. Yet loyalty was not uniform. Many towns weighed their options carefully. War fatigue was widespread. Resources were finite. During these years, the English military machine remained organised but stretched. Holding territory required garrisons and funding. Communication between England and continental administrators required coordination. Meanwhile, Charles VII, though lacking broad recognition at first, began to build support in the Loire Valley. The balance seemed to favour England, yet history rarely follows a straight line. The momentum achieved under Henry V depended heavily on his leadership. Without him, maintaining unity among regents and allies became more complex. By the late 1420s, English forces laid siege to the city of Orléans, a strategic gateway to southern France. If the city fell, resistance under Charles VII would weaken significantly. The siege tightened gradually, and observers assumed it would conclude as others had. Instead, events at Orléans would mark a turning point unlike any earlier episode in the war. A young woman from rural France would soon enter the scene, altering morale and direction in ways neither court had anticipated. The decades since Edward III first claimed the French crown had produced cycles of conquest, recovery, division, and reform. Military tactics had evolved, political alliances had shifted, the conflict had endured through generations. As Orléans endured its siege, the war stood on the threshold of transformation once more. By the autumn of 1428, the siege of Orléans had become the central focus of the war. English forces, supported by Burgundian allies, encircled the city with a series of fortified positions designed to restrict movement and starve defenders into submission. Orléans stood along the Loire River, and its location made it strategically vital. If it fell, English control could extend further into territories still loyal to Charles VII. Inside the city, supplies were limited but not yet exhausted. Morale fluctuated. Some believed relief would come, others feared that resistance would only delay the inevitable. Charles VII, whose authority was strongest in the south, faced criticism for failing to break the siege. His court at Chinon remained uncertain, cautious, and financially strained. It was during this period that a young woman from the village of Domremy arrived in the wider political landscape. Her name was Joan. She was the daughter of a farmer, without noble background or formal military training, yet she claimed to have received divine guidance instructing her to support Charles VII and drive the English from France. Joan first sought an audience with local commanders in early 1429. Initial reactions were sceptical. France had endured decades of conflict. Unconventional claims were treated cautiously. However, the situation at Orléans was serious enough that unconventional measures gained attention. Joan was eventually permitted to travel to Chinon to meet Charles VII. At court, Joan was examined by theologians and advisers. Her sincerity and confidence impressed some observers. After deliberation, she was allowed to accompany a relief force heading toward Orléans. She did not command in the traditional sense, but her presence carried symbolic weight. She wore armour, carried a banner, and insisted on direct action. In April 1429, Joan entered Orléans. Her arrival coincided with renewed determination among the defenders. French commanders, some initially cautious about her influence, found that morale rose visibly. The siege did not end through a single dramatic charge. Instead, French forces launched a series of coordinated attacks on English fortifications surrounding the city. One by one, key positions fell. The English, stretched thin and facing unexpectedly strong resistance, began to withdraw. By May 1429, the siege was lifted. The outcome did not destroy English power in France, but it disrupted assumptions about inevitability Orléans had held. Following this success, momentum shifted. Joan urged Charles VII to proceed to Reims for coronation. Reims lay deep within territory contested or controlled by Burgundian allies. The journey required advancing through towns that had not yet declared loyalty to Charles. As French forces moved northward, resistance was less than anticipated. Some towns opened their gates rather than endure siege. In July 1429, Charles VII was crowned in Reims Cathedral. The coronation carried symbolic significance. It reinforced his claim as legitimate King of France in the traditional site of royal anointing. Joan's influence was closely tied to this moment. Her role as a catalyst for morale and unity had tangible political consequences, yet she did not operate in isolation. Experienced commanders planned operations. Regional leaders calculated advantages. The lifting of the siege and the coronation represented combined effort, even if Joan's presence drew public attention. The war did not end after Reims. English and Burgundian forces remained active. Paris, still under Anglo-Burgundian control, resisted French attempts at capture. In 1430, Joan was captured during a skirmish near Compiègne by Burgundian troops. Her detention altered the emotional tone of the conflict. The Burgundians transferred Joan to English custody. She was put on trial in Rouen in 1431, accused of heresy and related charges. The proceedings were conducted by ecclesiastical authorities aligned with English interests. Legal formalities were observed, though questions about fairness arose even at the time. Joan was convicted and executed in May 1431. Her death removed a visible symbol of resistance, but it did not reverse the broader shift that had begun. Charles VII retained the legitimacy conferred at Reims. French forces continued to operate under reorganized leadership. Meanwhile, political dynamics shifted again. In 1435, the Treaty of Arras reconciled Charles VII with Philip the Good of Burgundy. The alliance between Burgundy and England, crucial to earlier English success, dissolved. Without Burgundian support, English positions in France became more vulnerable. Charles VII pursued reforms that strengthened the French monarchy structurally. He established a more permanent taxation system to fund standing forces. Rather than relying solely on feudal levies, France began developing a more centralized military apparatus. This change reduced dependence on unpredictable noble contingents. English governance in France faced increasing strain. Holding territory required constant funding. Domestic concerns in England diverted attention and resources. Henry VI, now older, lacked the decisive leadership associated with his father. His reign was marked by internal factionalism. Throughout the 1440s, French forces regained ground steadily. Campaigns were organized with improved artillery, reflecting advancements in gunpowder technology. Sieges became more efficient. English strongholds fell incrementally. The memory of Joan persisted in France, not only as a figure of faith but as a symbol of restored confidence. Her trial would later be reviewed, and she would be declared innocent decades after her death. Yet during these years, practical military reform mattered as much as symbolic inspiration. By the early 1450s, the English position in France had narrowed considerably. Only a few key territories remained under their control. The long contest that had begun with dynastic dispute was approaching its conclusion. The Siege of Orléans had marked a turning point not because it ended the war immediately, but because it reversed a pattern. For the first time in decades, French forces moved consistently forward rather than recovering lost ground. Institutional reform, political reconciliation, and sustained strategy reinforced this shift. The conflict would soon close with final campaigns in southwestern France. What remained of English continental ambition would be tested in a last series of engagements. By the early 1440s, the structure of the war had changed in ways that were less dramatic than Agincourt or Orléans, but far more decisive. The conflict no longer revolved around sudden battlefield encounters between mounted nobles. It now depended on administration, taxation, artillery, and sustained coordination. Charles VII had learned from decades of instability, and he understood that reclaiming France required institutional strength as much as courage. One of his most significant reforms was the creation of a more permanent royal army. Earlier phases of the war had relied heavily on feudal levies, nobles who provided troops for limited periods. This system lacked consistency. Commanders changed. Discipline varied. Loyalty depended on personal obligation. Charles VII sought to reduce this unpredictability. Through the establishment of the Compagnies d'Ordonnance in the 1440s, he created units of cavalry that were paid and maintained directly by the crown. These forces were not summoned temporarily. They existed as a standing presence. Financing such forces required stable revenue. The French monarchy expanded the taille, a direct tax that became more regularized. Though taxation remained unpopular, it provided predictable income for defense. Over time, the Crown's ability to collect funds without constant negotiation strengthened central authority. The monarchy that had once struggled to coordinate feudal loyalties now developed administrative continuity. At the same time, artillery technology advanced steadily. Gunpowder weapons were not entirely new, but their reliability improved. Cannons became more mobile and more accurate. Sieges, once prolonged affairs dependent on starvation and negotiation, could now be shortened through bombardment. Fortified walls that had resisted arrows and traditional siege engines proved vulnerable to sustained cannon fire. England faced contrasting circumstances. Henry VI, unlike his father, did not project martial energy. His personality inclined toward piety and gentleness rather than command. English governance in France relied heavily on appointed regents and military captains. Without Burgundian alliance, maintaining influence across northern territories became increasingly difficult. The Duke of Bedford, who had overseen English interests in France after Henry V's death, died in 1435. His absence weakened coordination. English positions in Paris and Normandy were still formidable, but they required reinforcement and financial commitment from across the Channel. Domestic priorities in England, including tensions among noble families, competed for attention. French advances during the 1440s were methodical. Towns that had long been contested shifted allegiance. Normandy became a primary objective. In 1449, hostilities resumed decisively after a fragile truce period. Charles VII launched a campaign aimed at reclaiming the region that Henry V had conquered decades earlier. French forces moved through Normandy with improved organisation. Key towns fell in succession. English defenders, though experienced, were outnumbered and often isolated. Artillery reduced fortifications that once would have required lengthy blockades. The cumulative effect of these operations narrowed English control significantly. In 1450, the Battle of Formigny dealt a heavy blow to English efforts to hold Normandy. French artillery and coordinated infantry tactics proved effective against English positions. Reinforcements from England were limited. The region that had symbolised Henry V's triumph was steadily slipping away. By 1453, the conflict concentrated in southwestern France, particularly in Gascony. Bordeaux, long loyal to the English crown due to commercial ties, became the centre of resistance. English commanders attempted to rally support, and for a moment it seemed possible that Gascony might endure as a final enclave. The decisive confrontation occurred at the Battle of Castillon in July 1453. French forces, entrenched and supported by powerful artillery, faced an English army led by John Talbot, a veteran commander. Talbot, confident from past experience, launched an attack without fully assessing the strength of French defensive positions. The French cannons inflicted heavy casualties. Talbot himself was killed during the engagement. The defeat at Castillon effectively ended major English military presence in southwestern France. Bordeaux surrendered shortly thereafter. By the end of 1453, England retained only Calais and its surrounding Pale on the continent. The extensive territories claimed and contested over generations had been lost. Though no formal peace treaty immediately concluded the war, active large-scale combat ceased. After more than a century of intermittent struggle, the 100 Years' War had run its course. Its duration had not been a continuous stream of battles, but a sequence of phases shaped by shifting leadership, plague, reform, and opportunity. The consequences were profound. France emerged with a stronger centralised monarchy. The authority of the crown, once constrained by feudal fragmentation, had expanded. Permanent taxation and standing forces became enduring features of governance. The war had accelerated the transition from medieval feudal structures toward early modern statehood. England, in contrast, faced internal instability soon after the war's end. The loss of French territories reduced continental entanglement, but intensified domestic rivalries. Within 2 years of Castillon, conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York erupted into what became known as the Wars of the Roses. The financial strain and political tensions accumulated during the long French conflict contributed to this unrest. Culturally, the war reshaped identity. In earlier centuries, the English ruling elite had maintained close ties to French language and custom. Over time, distinctions hardened. English increasingly became the language of administration and literature within England. In France, loyalty to the Valois monarchy strengthened regional cohesion. Shared struggle fostered emerging national consciousness on both sides. Military practice had also evolved permanently. The dominance of heavily armoured cavalry declined relative to disciplined infantry and missile troops. The integration of artillery into battlefield and siege operations changed fortification design across Europe. Warfare became more technical, requiring logistical planning and sustained funding. For ordinary people, the war's legacy was mixed. Some regions endured repeated devastation from raids and sieges. Others experienced administrative reforms that brought greater consistency to taxation and law. Generations grew up knowing no true peace between the two crowns. Yet by the mid-15th century, a different political landscape had formed. The claim that Edward III had first advanced in 1337, rooted in dynastic argument and personal ambition, had not succeeded in placing an English monarch permanently on the first French throne. Instead, it had produced a long transformation. France consolidated. England withdrew. Both kingdoms entered new phases, shaped by lessons learned in prolonged conflict. As Calais remained the last English foothold in France, it stood less as a symbol of expansion and more as a reminder of a century defined by assertion and resistance. The Channel, once crossed repeatedly by armies, would gradually resume its role as boundary rather than bridge. The war had begun with uncertainty over succession. It ended with clearer distinctions between kingdoms that would continue to interact, trade, and sometimes compete, but no longer contest a shared crown with sustained military force. The 100 Years' War did not conclude in a single ceremony or proclamation. It faded as campaigns ceased and attention shifted inward. Yet its imprint on governance, military organisation, and collective identity endured long after swords were set aside. When large-scale fighting in France came to an end in 1453, England did not experience a simple return to stability. The loss of almost all continental possessions altered political expectations at home. For more than a century, English kings had justified taxation, military organisation, and noble cooperation through campaigns in France. Now that objective had vanished, but the financial and political structures built to sustain it remained. Henry VI was still king. Unlike his father, he had never led armies personally into France. His reign had been shaped by regency councils, factional influence, and gradual territorial decline overseas. The final defeats in Gascony and Normandy did not produce immediate revolt, yet they weakened confidence in royal leadership. The English nobility had long derived prestige and wealth from service in France. Commanders who once governed continental territories now returned home. Some brought experience and ambition without clear outlets. The redistribution of influence within England intensified competition among powerful families. Financial strain compounded these tensions. War had required borrowing and taxation. With continental revenues gone, the Crown's resources tightened. Royal patronage grants of land, offices, and favour became more contested. When a monarchy lacks surplus resources, favour becomes scarce, and scarcity encourages rivalry. In 1453, the same year as the Battle of Crécy, Henry VI experienced a severe mental breakdown. For a period, he was unable to govern effectively. The condition recalled, in unsettling parallel, the earlier incapacity of Charles VI of France. England now faced its own uncertainty of authority. During Henry's incapacity, Richard, Duke of York, was appointed Protector of the Realm. York possessed a strong dynastic claim to the throne through descent from Edward III. His appointment was initially presented as temporary stewardship rather than rebellion. Yet political divisions deepened between supporters of York and those loyal to the king's Lancastrian faction. These divisions escalated into armed conflict beginning in 1455, marking the opening of what later became known as the Wars of the Roses. Though separate from the 100 Years' War in cause and geography, this internal struggle cannot be separated from the long French conflict and its underlying pressures. Decades of military mobilization had accustomed nobles to raising troops. Disputes over legitimacy had already shaped political culture. The habits of warfare were not easily set aside. While England turned inward, France continued to consolidate. Charles VII strengthened administrative institutions that would endure beyond his reign. Royal authority extended more uniformly across territory. Taxation systems stabilized. A permanent army became an accepted feature of governance. The contrast between the two kingdoms was clear. France emerged from the conflict more centralized. England entered a period of dynastic instability. Yet this divergence did not mean permanent imbalance. Both realms would continue evolving under new leadership. In France, the later years of Charles VII's rule focused on maintaining gains. Artillery units became standard components of royal forces. Fortifications were redesigned to withstand cannon fire. The crown increasingly appointed officials based on competence rather than solely on noble birth. Bureaucracy expanded gradually. Trade networks also recovered. Regions long affected by raids and sieges began rebuilding infrastructure. Markets reopened with greater security. The Loire Valley, once threatened by English advance, became a centre of royal patronage and cultural development. When Charles VII died in 1461, his son Louis XI succeeded him. Louis continued policies of centralisation, though with his own distinctive methods. He worked to limit the power of large nobles and to strengthen direct royal control. The monarchy that Louis inherited was stronger than the one his grandfather had governed during the crisis years. Meanwhile, England's internal conflict continued through shifting victories between Lancastrian and Yorkist factions. In 1461, Edward IV, a Yorkist claimant, took the throne after defeating Lancastrian forces. The crown changed hands multiple times over the next decades. Though France was no longer the central battlefield, the experience of prolonged external war had shaped the political environment in which these struggles unfolded. Calais remained England's final continental possession. It served as a trading hub and symbolic reminder of former ambitions. The port's retention allowed England to maintain a limited presence in European affairs, but it no longer represented expansive territorial control. The conclusion of the 100 Years' War also influenced cultural identity. In England, French had once been the dominant language of the aristocracy. Over time, English became the primary language of administration and literature. Writers such as Geoffrey Chaucer had already contributed to this linguistic shift earlier in the 14th century, but the separation from French political ambitions reinforced it. In France, the war encouraged a sense of collective identity centred on the monarchy. The memory of resistance, including the role of figures like Joan, contributed to a narrative of endurance. Regional differences remained significant, yet loyalty to a unified crown strengthened. Military developments continued to evolve. The longbow, which had once transformed battlefields, gradually gave way to firearms as technology advanced. Artillery innovation influenced castle architecture across Europe. The age of feudal cavalry dominance had been permanently altered. Economically, both kingdoms adapted to post-war conditions. England redirected attention toward maritime trade and domestic development. France focused on rebuilding agricultural productivity and strengthening internal markets. War had disrupted patterns, but recovery created new opportunities. The diplomatic relationship between the two kingdoms also changed. Though rivalry persisted, open claims to each other's crowns diminished. Diplomatic marriages and negotiated truces replaced large-scale invasions. The memory of devastation tempered appetite for renewed, prolonged conflict. The war's duration, spanning more than a century, meant that few individuals experienced its entire arc. It began in 1337 under Edward III and Philip VI and effectively concluded in 1453 under Henry VI, and generations were born, lived, and died within its context. The conflict became a backdrop to daily life. As England's Wars of the Roses unfolded, France observed but did not intervene extensively. Internal consolidation remained the priority. When Henry Tudor eventually claimed the English throne as Henry VII in 1485, ending the Wars of the Roses, a new dynasty emerged. His reign marked another transition towards centralised authority within England, paralleling earlier French developments. By the close of the 15th century, both kingdoms had moved into a different political landscape from the one that existed when Edward III first asserted his claim. The medieval framework of overlapping feudal obligations had shifted toward more defined territorial sovereignty. Kings ruled more directly. Armies were increasingly professional. Tax systems were more structured. The 100 Years' War, though rooted in dynastic dispute, had accelerated these transformations. It did not create modern nation-states instantly, but it advanced the processes that made them possible. Governance became more bureaucratic. Warfare became more organized and technological. Identity became more closely tied to territorial kingdoms rather than personal allegiance to a cross-channel aristocracy. In the quiet decades after 1453, rebuilding replaced campaigning. Fields once trampled by armies were cultivated again. Towns repaired walls and reopened markets. Political energy redirected from continental conquest to internal management. The memory of long conflict did not disappear. It shaped chronicles, legal reforms, and collective understanding of monarchy. Yet daily life gradually detached from the immediacy of siege and raid. Stability, though imperfect, returned. The war had altered both England and France in lasting ways. It had begun with a question of inheritance and concluded with clearer distinctions of sovereignty. The Channel became less a contested corridor and more a recognized boundary. As the 15th century progressed, Europe itself entered broader change. Exploration, technological innovation, and intellectual movements would soon reshape the continent further. The kingdoms that had endured a century of rivalry now faced new horizons beyond the arguments of 1337. Although open warfare between England and France subsided after 1453, the legacy of the conflict continued to shape governance, society, and political thinking on both sides of the Channel. The war had not merely transferred territory back and forth, it had redefined expectations about monarchy and responsibility. In France, the Valois monarchy emerged with greater structural authority than it had possessed a century earlier. The repeated necessity of funding defence had normalised permanent taxation. The taille became an established royal revenue rather than an emergency measure. This financial stability allowed the crown to maintain standing forces without relying entirely on feudal summons. The compagnies d'ordonnance, initially created for wartime need, continued as the core of a royal army. Their existence meant that the king possessed troops loyal directly to him. Over time, this reduced the independent military power of regional nobles. Authority became less personal and more institutional. Administrative offices also expanded. Officials trained in law and finance began to play larger roles in governance. Royal councils included men whose authority derived from expertise rather than lineage alone. The bureaucracy did not eliminate noble influence, but it altered its balance. Louis XI, who followed Charles VII, reinforced these developments. He worked persistently to reduce the autonomy of powerful dukes, including those in Burgundy. Through diplomacy, strategic marriages, and occasional conflict, he sought to integrate semi-independent territories more closely into the crown's domain. The Burgundian state, which had once played a decisive role in the war's middle phase, gradually declined after the death of Charles the Bold in 1477. French expansion absorbed some Burgundian lands. The fragmentation that had once weakened France during the war diminished further. In England, consolidation followed a different path. The Wars of the Roses, though distinct from the French conflict, were influenced by patterns established during prolonged warfare. Noble families accustomed to raising troops and commanding garrisons now applied similar methods in domestic rivalry. When Henry VII secured the English throne in 1485, he inherited a kingdom weary of internal strife. His approach emphasized fiscal caution and careful control of noble power. Rather than pursuing renewed continental conquest, he focused on stabilizing the monarchy at home. Henry VII strengthened royal finances by tightening oversight of revenue collection. Bonds and recognizances limited the independence of nobles. The crown regained economic footing gradually. England's attention shifted increasingly toward maritime trade and diplomacy rather than large-scale land campaigns in France. The linguistic and cultural effects of the 100 Years' War remained visible. In England, the use of English in government and literature became standard. French influence and vocabulary persisted, but the political separation reinforced distinct identity. The aristocracy no longer defined itself primarily through cross-channel estates. In France, loyalty to the crown grew more centralized. Regional dialects and customs remained strong, yet the monarchy increasingly represented a unifying authority. The memory of foreign occupation, particularly in northern territories, reinforced attachment to domestic sovereignty. Military evolution did not halt with the war's conclusion. The effectiveness of artillery during final campaigns influenced European fortification design. Walls grew lower and thicker to resist cannon fire. Engineers became as essential as knights. Firearms gradually supplemented or replaced traditional archery. Naval development also gained importance. Control of the Channel had been crucial during the conflict. Both kingdoms recognized the strategic necessity of maintaining capable fleets. Maritime strength would soon become central to future expansion beyond Europe. The war's long duration also affected economic patterns. Regions repeatedly targeted by chevauchés experienced demographic shifts. Some rural populations declined permanently. In other areas, reconstruction fostered innovation. Agricultural methods adapted to changing labor availability following plague and conflict. Trade networks realigned as well. English wool exports, which had once linked England closely to Flemish markets and influenced alliances, continued but under different political conditions. French wine exports recovered gradually. Merchants adapted to new boundaries. The legal concept of sovereignty evolved through the war's experience. Earlier medieval structures had tolerated overlapping loyalties and vassal obligations that crossed borders. The conflict demonstrated the instability of such arrangements. By its end, clearer territorial jurisdiction became preferred. Royal propaganda during the war had also shaped popular perception. Chronicles emphasized legitimacy, valor, and divine favor. Over time, these narratives contributed to national myths. Figures such as Henry V and Joan became part of collective memory, though interpreted differently across centuries. Educational institutions and record-keeping improved during and after the war. Administrative demands required documentation. Charters, tax rolls, and correspondence increased in volume. Historians today rely heavily on these records, many of which originated from wartime governance. The social fabric bore long-term marks. Veterans reintegrated into civilian life, sometimes receiving land grants or pensions. Widows and orphans required support structures. Religious institutions provided continuity amid uncertainty. Monasteries and churches recorded losses and memorials. Diplomatic relations between England and France did not vanish into hostility after 1453. Negotiations, truces, and occasional limited conflicts occurred, but none matched the sustained scale of the previous century. Mutual recognition replaced persistent claim. Calais remained under English control until 1558, long after the formal end of the 100 Years' War. Its eventual loss under Mary I symbolised the final closing of a long chapter of English territorial presence in France. By the close of the 15th century, Europe itself entered a period of transformation. The Renaissance influenced art and scholarship. Printing technology expanded communication. Exploration voyages by Iberian kingdoms began connecting Europe to wider oceans. The political lessons learned during the 100 Years' War informed how monarchies approached these new developments. The war's endurance across generations had taught rulers the value of sustained administration over impulsive conquest. Financial systems became more methodical. Diplomatic negotiation grew more structured. Military command incorporated planning and logistics in ways earlier centuries had not required. For ordinary subjects, the memory of raids and sieges gradually receded into stories told by elders. Towns rebuilt marketplaces, fields returned to cultivation, The presence of a standing army meant that future defence could respond more quickly to threat, but it also signalled that warfare had become a permanent state function rather than an occasional noble enterprise. The question that had ignited the conflict, who held rightful claim to the French crown, lost urgency as new. Dynasties secured internal legitimacy. The English monarchy ceased pressing its claim with sustained military force. The French monarchy solidified its hereditary line. The 100 Years' War did not produce a single decisive treaty comparable to later European conflicts. Instead, it concluded through exhaustion, consolidation, and shifting priorities. Its legacy was less about a moment of peace and more about structural transformation. The Channel remained a boundary, but trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange continued across it. Rivalry would resurface in future centuries under different circumstances. Yet the age in which an English king could realistically attempt to rule France through dynastic claim had passed. The war's true outcome lay not in territorial lines alone, but in the emergence of clearer national frameworks. Both England and France entered the early modern period, shaped by what they had endured and learned. By the early 16th century, the 100 Years' War was no longer an active memory for most people, yet its imprint remained embedded in institutions, borders, and expectations. The generation that had fought at Agincourt or defended Orléans had passed away. What endured was the structure they left behind. In France, the monarchy that emerged from the long conflict possessed tools unknown to its Capetian predecessors in 1337. Taxation had become routine rather than exceptional. A standing army existed not as an emergency measure, but as a permanent instrument of state. Royal courts and administrative councils functioned with continuity. Authority radiated more directly from the centre. This did not eliminate regional identity or noble ambition. Dukes and counts continued to wield influence, yet their power operated within a clearer framework defined by the crown. The fragmentation that had once allowed English armies to exploit factional division had narrowed. The French crown also invested in infrastructure. Roads and fortifications were maintained with greater regularity. Cities such as Paris regained stability as centres of governance and culture. Trade across internal regions improved as security increased. The Loire Valley, which had served as a refuge during crisis years, developed into a seat of royal residence and patronage. In England, the Tudor dynasty that began with Henry VII focused on restoring internal order after decades of civil conflict. The monarchy's experience during the French War had demonstrated the risks of excessive noble autonomy. Henry VII employed financial oversight and strategic marriages to limit potential rivals. His approach was careful rather than expansive. Foreign policy under the early Tudors did not immediately pursue large-scale conquest in France. Instead, diplomacy and limited campaigns characterized relations. England remained attentive to continental affairs, but the ambition to claim the French crown receded into formality. The linguistic separation between ruling elites in the two kingdoms became more complete. In England, French ceased to function as the language of court and law. English literary culture expanded. The war had accelerated this shift by reinforcing political distinction. Identity increasingly aligned with territorial sovereignty rather than aristocratic heritage across borders. Military organisation in both kingdoms reflected lessons learned. Infantry and artillery gained central roles. The prestige of heavy cavalry persisted ceremonially, but battlefield reality had changed. Firearms gradually supplemented longbows. Fortification design incorporated angled bastions capable of resisting cannon. The war had also influenced legal theory. The need to justify taxation and military mobilization encouraged articulation of sovereign authority. Kings claimed responsibility for defending defined territories rather than overlapping feudal networks. Subjects, in turn, began to conceive of allegiance within clearer geographic bounds. The Channel remained a conduit for trade and communication. Merchants travelled between ports. diplomatic envoys negotiated alliances, often in response to broader European rivalries involving Spain or the Holy Roman Empire. The nature of competition shifted from dynastic claim to strategic balance. Historical writing during the 15th and early 16th centuries began to interpret the long conflict retrospectively. Chroniclers in England emphasised moments such as Agincourt as evidence of valour and divine favour. French accounts highlighted endurance and ultimate recovery. These narratives shaped collective memory. In France, the memory of Joan of Arc persisted in local tradition before formal rehabilitation processes later recognised her role more fully. Her story became intertwined with the broader narrative of resistance and legitimacy. In England, the image of Henry V endured as a model of disciplined kingship. Economically, the redirection of resources away from continental war allowed both kingdoms to invest domestically. In England, maritime ventures expanded gradually, laying groundwork for later exploration. In France, internal consolidation strengthened agricultural productivity and urban growth. The long arc of the 100 Years' War had demonstrated that sustained conflict demanded more than bravery. It required administrative continuity, financial planning, and adaptability. These insights informed how monarchies approached subsequent challenges. Although no single treaty ceremonially ended the war in 1453, its effective conclusion reshaped European political thought. The idea that sovereignty should correspond to territorial boundaries gained prominence. Overlapping feudal allegiances across borders became increasingly impractical. The Channel became a more definitive separation of authority. English kings maintained the formal title King of France for centuries afterward, but the claim functioned symbolically rather than practically. Real governance no longer extended across large portions of French territory. The war's duration had normalised the concept of protracted conflict. States learned to mobilise resources across generations. Military service became professionalised. Bureaucracies adapted to long-term planning rather than temporary campaigns. Socially, the war had influenced mobility. Soldiers travelled between regions. Refugees relocated during sieges. Merchants adapted to fluctuating frontiers. Cultural exchange did not cease, but it occurred within clearer political divisions. As Europe moved into the 16th century, new conflicts would arise: religious wars, imperial rivalries, and overseas expansion. The institutions shaped during the 100 Years' War provided frameworks for these developments. Monarchies were better equipped to sustain complex diplomacy and warfare. For England and France alike, the conflict marked the closing chapter of a medieval pattern of cross-channel aristocratic integration. Nobles no longer held vast estates on both sides of the water with the same political implication. Loyalties were increasingly national in character. The war's conclusion did not create immediate peace between the two kingdoms in all respects. Tensions resurfaced periodically. Yet the specific dynastic struggle that began with Edward III's claim in 1337 had effectively ended. Its ambitions no longer defined policy. Over a century of alternating triumph and setback had forged more centralised states. The transformation was gradual rather than sudden. Each phase, Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, Orléans, Castillon, had contributed to a longer process. The 100 Years' War thus stands less as a single war in the modern sense, and more as a prolonged era of rivalry. It shaped institutions, identities, and expectations that endured long after the last battlefield cannon fell silent. The crowns that once competed for shared inheritance emerged distinct, governing territories more clearly defined than before. In that separation lay the war's most lasting result. As the 16th century progressed, the memory of the long Anglo-French struggle settled into something quieter than lived experience, but stronger than distant legend. It became part of how each kingdom understood itself. The 100 Years' War had not only shifted borders, it had shaped political instinct. In France, the consolidation achieved under Charles VII and Louis XI continued under their successors. The monarchy expanded its administrative reach through appointed officials known as bailies and seneschaux, who enforced royal justice and collected revenue. These officers were not independent feudal lords. They represented the crown directly. Over time, their presence normalized centralized governance across provinces once loosely coordinated. The crown also deepened its reliance on written record. Tax registers, legal decisions, and military accounts were preserved with increasing care. Wartime necessity had required documentation, and peace did not diminish that habit. Bureaucracy, once auxiliary, became foundational. The standing army, refined during the war's final decades, evolved further. Artillery corps were maintained in readiness. Engineers specialized in fortification design. Command structures became more hierarchical. Military professionalism advanced gradually, reflecting lessons learned during the long struggle against England. In England, the Tudor monarchy applied similar awareness of structure, though in different form. Henry VII avoided costly continental wars, preferring diplomatic marriages and commercial treaties. His son, Henry VIII, would later pursue campaigns in France, but these were limited in scale compared to earlier centuries. They did not attempt full dynastic takeover. The English Parliament, strengthened during wartime taxation debates, remained an important partner in governance. War had required negotiation with representatives of shires and towns. That practice continued. Parliamentary approval for revenue became customary. The institutional dialogue between crown and subjects had deepened during the French conflict and endured afterward. Language and literature in England flourished in a more distinctly English voice. The separation from French political ambition allowed cultural development without reliance on continental aristocratic identity. Chronicles recounted victories like Agincourt with pride, but they were framed within a narrative of English resilience rather than cross-channel inheritance. In France, the rehabilitation of Joan of Arc in the later 15th century reflected the monarchy's interest in reinforcing legitimacy. Her posthumous retrial in 1456 had cleared her name. By the 16th century, she represented endurance and unity. Her story was not isolated from institutional reform. It complemented it. Economic recovery followed a long arc. Regions devastated by chevauchés and sieges required decades to stabilize. Agricultural production gradually returned to pre-war levels. Urban markets regained vibrancy. Trade across Europe expanded, now connected to broader networks reaching the Mediterranean and Atlantic. The war had also contributed indirectly to maritime awareness. Control of the Channel had proven essential. Naval organization in both kingdoms improved. Shipbuilding and port management received attention. These skills would later support overseas ventures. Diplomatically, England and France increasingly approached one another as sovereign equals rather than rival claimants to a single crown. Alliances formed and dissolved in response to wider European politics, including Habsburg expansion and Italian campaigns. The nature of competition shifted from inheritance dispute to strategic balance. Legal theory matured in tandem. Jurists wrote more clearly about sovereignty as indivisible within defined territory. The earlier medieval model where a king might hold lands in another realm as vassal appeared unstable in retrospect. The 100 Years' War had demonstrated the complications of divided allegiance. Education and literacy expanded gradually during this period. Universities and clerical institutions, which had continued operating through the war, contributed to administrative training. Officials needed familiarity with law and finance. Governance required expertise beyond noble lineage. In England, the memory of losing French territories influenced caution in foreign policy. While campaigns occurred intermittently, they were framed within limited objectives. The appetite for sustained occupation diminished. Domestic consolidation took priority. France, meanwhile, projected increased confidence. The Crown's ability to levy troops and revenue enabled participation in broader continental conflicts. Though internal challenges remained, the monarchy no longer faced the same fragmentation that had characterized earlier centuries. The the psychological effect of prolonged war also lingered subtly. Generations raised amid uncertainty had valued stability. Both kingdoms demonstrated preference for internal order after 1453. This did not prevent conflict entirely, but it moderated ambitions. The 100 Years' War thus shaped the transition from medieval to early modern Europe. It illustrated that kingship required more than hereditary claim. It required sustained administration. It demonstrated that military success depended on organisation and technology. It revealed that loyalty could not rest solely on feudal custom. When historians later examined the period, they often divided it into phases: the Edwardian War, the Caroline War, the Lancastrian War. Yet to those living through it, the experience felt continuous in its implications. Even during truces, the possibility of renewed conflict influenced planning. By the time Renaissance humanism spread across Europe, both England and France were equipped with more structured states. Cultural exchange continued, but within clearer national frameworks. Monarchies sponsored art and architecture that emphasized domestic glory. The 100 Years' War had begun with uncertainty over succession after the death of Charles IV in 1328. It concluded without an English king seated on the French throne. Instead, it left behind centralized governments, standing armies, regular taxation, and distinct political identities. The Channel once again became primarily a space of commerce rather than invasion. Ships carried goods and envoys rather than armies. Ports that had witnessed embarkations for war now served expanding trade. The crowns that had contested inheritance matured into separate sovereign powers. Their rivalry did not vanish, but it assumed new forms suited to a changing Europe. The long era of alternating conquest and recovery had resolved not through decisive annihilation but through structural evolution. Each kingdom emerged altered, shaped by necessity, and prepared for challenges beyond the arguments that began in 1337. As the 16th century unfolded, the political culture shaped by the 100 Years' War matured into something more structured and deliberate. The rivalry between England and France did not disappear, yet it operated within boundaries that were clearer than before. Neither kingdom seriously pursued the medieval model of shared feudal allegiance across the Channel again. The lessons had been too costly. In France, the monarchy continued expanding administrative reach. Provincial estates still existed, and local privileges remained, but royal authority asserted itself more uniformly. Taxation, once negotiated irregularly, became routine. Military musters were organised through centralised command, rather than solely through noble obligation. The Crown's ability to deploy force without extensive negotiation represented a profound shift from the early 14th century. Royal justice also expanded. Appeals increasingly flowed towards central courts. Law became a tool of governance rather than merely a reflection of local custom. Officials trained in legal procedure formed an administrative class that owed loyalty to the monarch. This class provided continuity beyond individual reigns. The French army, maintained during peacetime, symbolised permanent readiness. Artillery units remained active. Engineers experimented with new defensive structures capable of resisting cannon fire. Fortifications evolved from high medieval walls to angled bastions designed to deflect impact. These changes reflected technological adaptation rooted in wartime experience. In England, the Tudor monarchy strengthened its own administrative mechanisms. Henry VII and Henry VIII relied on councils and financial oversight to limit noble autonomy. The Crown's revenue system became more efficient. War had once required extraordinary levies. Now the monarchy sought predictable income streams. English involvement in continental politics continued selectively. Henry VIII launched campaigns in France during his reign, but they lacked the scale or permanence of earlier invasions. They were diplomatic gestures as much as territorial ambitions. The idea of claiming the French crown endured ceremonially, yet it no longer guided policy. The cultural divide that solidified during the 100 Years' War deepened further. In England, the use of English in official documents became standard. literature flourished in the vernacular, identity centered on the island kingdom. In France, the monarchy promoted linguistic and administrative coherence across regions. Royal ordinances standardized legal language and practice. Economic transformation also accelerated. Maritime trade gained importance for both kingdoms. The experience of controlling and defending sea routes during wartime underscored the value of naval capability. Shipbuilding expanded gradually. Ports improved infrastructure to accommodate larger vessels. The Channel, once the site of invasion fleets, increasingly served as a commercial artery. Merchant vessels carried textiles, wine, and manufactured goods. Diplomatic envoys travelled between courts. Exchange replaced occupation. In the broader European context, the rise of powerful dynasties such as the Habsburgs shifted strategic calculations. France and England found themselves navigating alliances that extended beyond their bilateral rivalry. The war that once defined their relationship became one factor among many. The transformation in warfare extended beyond artillery. Infantry organization improved. Training and discipline became more formalized. Mercenary companies operated under contracts rather than feudal ties. The professionalization of soldiers marked a departure from earlier reliance on noble retinues. Social consequences persisted quietly. Regions heavily damaged during the war required long-term recovery. Agricultural techniques adapted to demographic change following plague and conflict. Urban centers that survived siege grew more cautious in planning defenses. Civic identity strengthened in some areas as communities rebuilt collectively. Memory of the war lingered in chronicles, ballads, and legal precedents. Stories of Crécy and Agincourt circulated in England. In France, the endurance of Orléans and the coronation at Reims remained part of historical consciousness. These narratives shaped national sentiment, though they were filtered through later interpretation. Diplomacy replaced dynastic conquest as the primary tool for influencing continental balance. Marriages between royal houses created temporary alignments. Trade agreements secured economic interests. Conflict, when it arose, tended to be limited in scope compared to the generational campaigns of the previous century. The concept of sovereignty matured into clearer doctrine. Rulers asserted exclusive authority within defined borders. Subjects increasingly associated allegiance with territory rather than personal ties to a lord whose lands crossed frontiers. The Channel's function as a boundary reinforced this principle. England's focus gradually expanded outward toward the Atlantic. Maritime ventures laid groundwork for exploration. France also engaged in overseas pursuits, though later than Iberian powers. The resources once devoted to protracted continental war became available for different enterprises. Within France, the monarchy continued centralizing through administrative reform. Provincial privileges were negotiated, but royal edicts carried increasing weight. Governance became more predictable, even if not universally welcomed. The war's necessity had established precedents that peace maintained. In England, Parliament remained integral to taxation approval. The interplay between Crown and representative bodies, strengthened during wartime financing, endured. While tension between monarch and Parliament would resurface in later centuries, the institutional habit of consultation had deep roots in the demands of the 100 Years' War. The final English loss of Calais in 1558 marked a symbolic conclusion to lingering continental presence. The port had served as the last remnant of a once expansive claim. Its surrender confirmed what had been effectively true since 1453. England's future lay primarily within its own borders and maritime sphere. France, unified under a more cohesive monarchy, entered the 16th century, prepared to contend with internal religious conflict and external rivalry. The administrative capacity developed during the 100 Years' War provided tools for managing these crises, even if not always successfully. The long conflict had functioned as a catalyst rather than a singular event. It compelled both kingdoms to refine taxation, military organization, diplomacy, and identity. It reduced the practicality of feudal cross-border inheritance and replaced it with clearer territorial sovereignty. By the time Renaissance culture flourished fully in both lands, the foundations laid during the war underpinned governance. Royal authority operated through bureaucracy. Armies stood ready in peacetime. Trade flowed across the Channel without expectation of immediate invasion. By the time the 16th century settled into its rhythm of reform, rivalry, and renewal, the 100 Years' War had become part of inherited understanding rather than living concern. Yet its influence remained woven into institutions that governed daily life. The habits formed during crisis had matured into normal practice. In France, the monarchy increasingly viewed itself as guardian of a unified realm. The crown's experience of near fragmentation during the war had left a lasting caution against allowing regional factions to dominate national direction. Royal policy favoured integration. Provincial assemblies retained local voice, but they operated within a broader framework defined by the king. The army, shaped in response to English campaigns, remained structured and disciplined. Recruitment followed organised channels. Artillery units stood as permanent fixtures. Commanders were appointed with attention to loyalty and competence. Warfare, when it occurred, followed patterns of coordination refined during the long struggle. Administrative documentation expanded further. Written orders, fiscal accounts, and legal rulings accumulated in centralised archives. The war had taught rulers that memory preserved in records strengthened authority. Governance became less dependent on personal recollection and more reliant on written continuity. England, too, retained the institutional adjustments forged in wartime. Parliamentary consent for taxation had become expected. Even when monarchs sought greater autonomy, they operated within traditions shaped during the French conflict. Financial administration was more systematic. Military organisation, though smaller in peacetime, remained attentive to readiness. The separation of aristocratic identity between the two kingdoms became more complete. In earlier centuries, noble families frequently held lands on both sides of the Channel. The war disrupted and gradually ended that pattern. By the 16th century, cross-channel estates were rare and politically insignificant. Loyalties aligned with single crowns. Cultural memory continued evolving. English chroniclers emphasised disciplined infantry and effective archery. French writers stressed endurance and rightful succession. These interpretations shaped education and public understanding. They also reinforced emerging national narratives. Technological adaptation accelerated. Firearms grew more reliable. Cannon design improved. Fortification architecture transformed across Europe. The impact of artillery at Castillon and earlier sieges informed engineers for generations. Defensive walls became lower and thicker. Angled bastions replaced vertical towers. Maritime development expanded in parallel. Control of sea routes, once critical for transporting armies, became vital for commerce and exploration. England invested in shipbuilding capacity that would later support Atlantic ventures. France, while more focused on continental affairs, also developed naval strength gradually. Economic integration within each kingdom strengthened as security improved. Trade between regions increased. Market towns flourished without constant fear of chevauché raids. Agricultural production stabilised. The recovery from plague and war took time, but by the late 15th century, demographic growth resumed. Diplomatic engagement replaced open contest over the French crown. Treaties addressed specific disputes rather than broad inheritance claims. Alliances shifted in response to wider European politics, including the influence of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. The bilateral rivalry no longer defined continental balance alone. Legal doctrine articulated sovereignty more explicitly. Jurists emphasized that kings exercised exclusive authority within territorial boundaries. The earlier medieval system, where a ruler could be both sovereign in one realm and vassal in another, appeared unstable after prolonged conflict. Clearer demarcation reduced ambiguity. The war had also influenced social mobility. service in armies had exposed individuals from modest backgrounds to broader networks. Some gained advancement through competence rather than lineage. Administrative roles expanded opportunities for educated commoners. Though social hierarchy remained strong, pathways for limited upward movement widened. Religious institutions played complex roles throughout the conflict and its aftermath. Clergy had mediated negotiations, collected taxes, and interpreted legitimacy. After the war, churches and monasteries continued serving as centres of learning and record-keeping. They preserved chronicles that later historians would consult. In England, the memory of continental loss tempered enthusiasm for permanent occupation abroad. While monarchs occasionally campaigned in France, ambitions remained measured. Domestic consolidation took priority. The experience of internal civil war reinforced caution. France, more secure territorially, turned attention to internal development and external rivalry beyond England. Its strengthened monarchy engaged in Italian campaigns and broader European diplomacy. The administrative capacity refined during the Hundred Years' War supported these ventures. By the early modern period, both kingdoms had entered a different political age from the one that began in 1337. The feudal mosaic of overlapping allegiances had given way to territorial states with defined borders. Standing armies and permanent taxation had become accepted realities. The Channel, once crossed repeatedly by invasion fleets, symbolised a clear division between two sovereign powers. Trade and diplomacy flourished, but claims to shared monarchy faded into ceremonial tradition. Historians looking back would note that the Hundred Years' War was not a single unbroken conflict, but a succession of campaigns, truces, and recoveries. Its endurance over generations allowed gradual transformation. Each phase contributed to a cumulative shift in governance and identity. For those living in the 16th century, the war belonged to the past, yet the institutions it shaped defined the present. The administrative state, the professional army, the concept of national sovereignty, these were the enduring results of a dispute that began with a contested crown. As the centuries moved forward, the 100 Years' War receded from daily concern, yet its consequences continued shaping the structure of European power. The conflict had begun in a feudal world of overlapping loyalties and personal claims. It ended in a landscape defined more clearly by territorial sovereignty and administrative continuity. That transition was gradual, but it was decisive. In France, the strengthened monarchy that emerged from the war became the foundation for later centralization under rulers such as Francis I and, in the 17th century, Louis XIII and Louis XIV. The capacity to levy taxes consistently, maintain standing forces, and enforce royal justice across provinces originated in wartime necessity. Over time, these powers expanded beyond military application and shaped domestic governance. Royal authority extended into cultural life as well. Patronage of art, architecture, and scholarship reinforced the image of a unified kingdom under a single crown. The sense of collective endurance that had formed during resistance to English occupation informed how the monarchy presented itself to its subjects. In England, the Tudor dynasty consolidated power in ways that reflected lessons learned from both the French War and the Wars of the Roses. The monarchy's focus turned toward maritime expansion, trade, and cautious continental engagement. The idea of claiming the French crown lingered in royal titulature but lacked practical urgency. Parliament remained central to taxation and legislation. The experience of financing prolonged war had established precedent for consultation. Even when later monarchs tested limits of authority, the institutional expectation persisted. Governance involved negotiation between crown and representatives, a pattern rooted partly in wartime fiscal demands. Military evolution continued on both sides of the Channel. Gunpowder weapons replaced longbows as primary ranged arms. Artillery shaped siegecraft and battlefield strategy. The transformation that had begun at Crécy and Castillon culminated in early modern armies that were larger, more disciplined, and increasingly professional. Fortification design responded accordingly. Italian-style bastioned fortresses spread across Europe. These structures reflected awareness that medieval castles no longer sufficed. The shift was not only architectural, it represented acceptance that warfare required technical expertise and sustained investment. The Channel's role shifted from invasion corridor to commercial highway. Merchant vessels crossed regularly, carrying textiles, wine, grain, and manufactured goods. Diplomatic envoys travelled with less fear of sudden hostilities. Trade relations, though occasionally strained, remained essential to both economies. Cultural memory preserved selective episodes of the war. In England, the narrative of Agincourt endured as a symbol of disciplined victory against odds. In France, the coronation at Reims and the lifting of the siege of Orléans remained central to national remembrance. These memories contributed to identity, but did not dictate policy. Historians began organising the conflict into coherent accounts. They described phases, leadership changes, and shifting strategies. Their work shaped later understanding of medieval transition. The 100 Years' War became a reference point for discussing the emergence of modern state structures. Legal scholars cited the war when articulating doctrines of sovereignty. They emphasized that divided allegiance across borders created instability. Clear jurisdiction within territorial limits offered greater security. The lessons were absorbed gradually into European political thought. Economically, both kingdoms adapted to new realities. England expanded wool and cloth production. France rebuilt vineyards and grain cultivation in regions once ravaged by chevauchés. The economic revival was not immediate, but steady progress followed the cessation of large-scale campaigns. Social change also endured. The war and plague had reduced populations significantly during earlier centuries. Labour scarcity altered relationships between landowners and workers. Over time, these shifts influenced social mobility and economic bargaining power. The war's long duration meant that no single treaty defined its conclusion. Instead, exhaustion, reform, and consolidation ended sustained conflict. The final English loss of Calais in 1558 symbolised closure, but by then the structural separation had long been established. Future Anglo-French rivalry would take different forms: colonial competition, naval warfare, shifting alliances. Yet these conflicts unfolded between sovereign states rather than claimants to a shared throne. The medieval dynastic dispute had ended definitively. The 100 Years' War stands as a bridge between eras. It began with knights asserting hereditary rights, and concluded with centralized administrations managing professional armies. It spanned generations that witnessed plague, rebellion, reform, and technological change. For those who lived through its early phases, the conflict felt immediate and uncertain. For later generations, it became part of inherited identity. Its lessons influenced how rulers governed, how armies were organized, and how subjects understood allegiance. The crowns that once contended for inheritance matured into distinct institutions. The Channel became boundary rather than battleground. Political ambition shifted toward consolidation and expansion in other directions. By the time the 16th century matured, the 100 Years' War had settled fully into historical memory, yet its structural consequences continued unfolding in quiet, lasting ways. What had begun as a dispute over dynastic succession had reshaped governance, identity, military practice, and diplomacy for both England and France. The transformation was not dramatic at its conclusion, but gradual and deeply rooted. In France, the monarchy that survived the crisis years of English occupation grew increasingly confident in its centralised authority. The fiscal systems strengthened under Charles VII became permanent instruments of rule. Regular taxation funded not only defence but also administration and court life. Royal officers extended their reach into provinces that had once operated with significant autonomy. The Crown's presence became routine rather than episodic. This stability allowed France to engage more consistently in continental affairs beyond England. Italian campaigns at the close of the 15th century reflected a monarchy prepared to project influence abroad. The capacity to mobilize troops, artillery, and funds without relying entirely on temporary feudal levies marked a decisive change from the early 14th century. The professional army, refined through decades of conflict, evolved further. Units maintained cohesion across reigns. Artillery corps operated as specialized branches. Siegecraft became systematic. The military innovations that had first proven effective against English forces now served broader strategic purposes. In England, the Tudor consolidation after the Wars of the Roses drew directly upon lessons from prolonged warfare. Henry VII limited noble retinues and strengthened financial oversight. Bonds and recognizances restrained powerful families from maintaining independent military followings. These measures reflected awareness that decentralized military power had fueled both foreign and domestic instability. Parliament's established role in approving taxation persisted. The long French campaigns had required consistent negotiation between monarch and representatives. That habit endured even when monarchs sought greater autonomy. Institutional dialogue remained embedded in governance. Cultural identity in both kingdoms solidified further. In England, literary expression in English expanded with confidence. The aristocracy no longer defined itself through continental estates. Loyalty centered on the island realm. In France, the crown promoted linguistic unity, encouraging standardized administration across regions. Economic development accelerated as warfare receded. Ports once used for troop embarkation transitioned into hubs of trade. Maritime commerce expanded steadily. England's orientation toward Atlantic routes strengthened during the later Tudor period. France, while more focused on continental security, gradually engaged in overseas ventures as well. Technological advancement in warfare continued shaping architecture and strategy. Gunpowder weapons improved in reliability. Fortifications adapted accordingly. Engineers trained in artillery science became valued advisors to rulers. Military organization required education and coordination beyond traditional knightly skill. Diplomatic relationships between England and France evolved into pragmatic negotiation rather than dynastic rivalry. Alliances shifted in response to broader European conflicts. Marriage treaties addressed balance of power rather than inheritance of crowns. Though hostility resurfaced intermittently, it lacked the generational persistence of the 100 Years' War. The concept of sovereignty gained clearer articulation in legal thought. Jurists emphasized exclusive authority within defined territorial boundaries. The medieval arrangement whereby a ruler might simultaneously be sovereign in one land and vassal in another appeared increasingly untenable. The war had demonstrated the instability of divided allegiance. Memory of the conflict persisted through chronicles and education. Battles such as Crécy and Agincourt remained points of reference in English accounts. In France, the endurance at Orleans and the coronation at Reims symbolized recovery and legitimacy. These memories shaped national narrative without reigniting the original dispute. Social consequences remained visible in demographic patterns. Regions once devastated by chevauchés experienced slower population recovery. Agricultural adaptation reflected lessons learned from scarcity and disruption. Communities invested in fortifications and local defense structures even during peace. Administrative record-keeping expanded significantly during and after the war. Governments preserved taxation rolls, military accounts, and legal proceedings with increasing precision. This habit of documentation strengthened continuity across generations of rulers. The final loss of Calais in 1558, more than a century after Castillon, marked symbolic closure for England's continental ambitions. Though English monarchs retained the formal title King of France for centuries thereafter, it carried ceremonial weight rather than realistic claim. Practical governance had long since recognized separate sovereignty. France entered the 17th century as a consolidated power prepared to assert influence across Europe. England, emerging from internal turmoil and religious transformation, developed maritime strength that would soon define its expansion. Both trajectories were shaped indirectly by the century of Anglo-French rivalry. The 100 Years' War had functioned as a prolonged catalyst. It compelled administrative innovation. It encouraged military modernization. It clarified political identity. It exposed the fragility of feudal networks and accelerated transition toward territorial states. By the early modern era, the Channel no longer represented a contested corridor of overlapping rule. It marked a boundary between two increasingly coherent sovereign powers. Trade and diplomacy continued across it, but inheritance claims did not. The war's duration ensured that its impact penetrated deeply into institutions. It was not a single event, but a series of adjustments. Each phase, initial dynastic challenge, battlefield innovation, internal revolt, reform, reconquest contributed to cumulative transformation. Later, European conflicts would operate within frameworks established during this era. States learned to sustain long campaigns through bureaucratic planning. Armies became permanent structures, taxation systems adapted to recurring need. Sovereignty became more clearly territorial. The dispute that began in 1337 ended not with shared monarchy but with strengthened separation. England and France emerged distinct, each defined by governance refined under pressure. The 100 Years' War did not create modern nations instantly, yet it prepared the ground. It bridged medieval custom and early modern administration. It reshaped how rulers ruled and how subjects understood allegiance. By the later 17th century, the structural transformation initiated during the 100 Years' War had become so embedded in political life that its origins were rarely questioned. England and France operated as established sovereign powers, each with centralized administration, organized military forces, and defined territorial identity. Yet the memory of their prolonged rivalry still informed policy and perception. In France, the growth of royal authority reached a high point under Louis XIV. His reign did not emerge from the 100 Years' War directly, yet the centralized systems he commanded were rooted in reforms that began during that earlier conflict. The capacity to levy taxes regularly, maintain a standing army, and enforce policy across provinces had matured over generations. Louis XIV's large, disciplined armies reflected the evolution of military organization from feudal levies to professional forces. Officers served through structured hierarchies. Artillery, once experimental in the 15th century, became standard. Fortresses designed by engineers such as Vauban embodied the technical sophistication that centuries of siege warfare had inspired. In England, governance followed a distinct yet related path. The tension between monarchy and parliament intensified during the 17th century, culminating in civil war and constitutional adjustment. The institutional expectation that taxation required parliamentary approval, strengthened during the 100 Years' War, played a role in shaping these conflicts. Fiscal authority remained central to debates about sovereignty. Naval development became increasingly important to England's identity and security. The experience of controlling the Channel during medieval campaigns had demonstrated the strategic value of maritime strength. By the time of the Anglo-Dutch Wars and later naval conflicts with France, England's orientation towards sea power was clear. Maritime defence replaced continental occupation as the primary strategic focus. Diplomatic rivalry between England and France persisted in new forms. Alliances shifted repeatedly across Europe. Conflicts were fought over colonial territories, trade routes, and balance of power rather than dynastic inheritance. The medieval dispute over succession had been replaced by early modern competition for influence. The legal concept of sovereignty, clarified during and after the 100 Years' War, matured further. Treaties emphasized defined borders and mutual recognition of authority. Even when wars occurred, they were framed within a system of states that acknowledged each other's territorial legitimacy. Economic competition expanded across oceans. English and French merchants established colonies and trading posts in North America, the Caribbean, and Asia. Naval engagement became central to rivalry. The Channel remained important, but global routes gained increasing significance. Cultural memory of the medieval conflict endured selectively. English literature and historical writing revisited the victories of Crécy and Agincourt. French narratives emphasized resilience and reconquest. These stories contributed to patriotic sentiment, but did not reignite claims to shared monarchy. Administrative professionalism advanced in both kingdoms. Bureaucracies expanded. Record-keeping systems improved. Taxation and military logistics operated through standardized procedures. The expectation that the state functioned continuously, rather than episodically, became established. The 100 Years' War had also contributed indirectly to the decline of feudal aristocratic independence. In France, noble power became increasingly subordinated to royal command. In England, the turbulence of civil conflict and subsequent constitutional settlement limited aristocratic militarization. The authority to raise private armies diminished over time. By the 18th century, the rivalry between England and France culminated in global conflicts such as the 7 Years' War. These contests were vast in scale, yet fundamentally different from the dynastic struggle that began in 1337. They were wars between established states rather than claimants to a single crown. The institutional capacity required to wage such global conflicts organized navies, tax systems, and professional armies owed much to transformations initiated during the medieval war. The ability to mobilize resources across years and continents had roots in earlier necessity. Socially, the long memory of the 100 Years' War shaped narratives of national endurance. In France, the recovery under Charles VII and later consolidation under Valois and Bourbon rulers reinforced loyalty to centralized monarchy. In England, the story of disciplined infantry and maritime resilience became part of identity. The Channel remained both connection and boundary. Trade, travel, and diplomacy crossed it routinely. Yet it symbolized separation rather than contested inheritance. The idea that a single monarch might legitimately rule both realms through dynastic claim no longer appeared plausible. Historians writing in later centuries examined the 100 Years' War as a defining transition. They described it as the end of medieval feudal entanglement and the beginning of modern statehood. Though such interpretations simplify complexity, they capture the broad arc of transformation. The conflict's endurance across generations ensured that its impact was structural rather than momentary. Institutions reshaped under pressure became permanent. Administrative systems built for survival became tools for expansion. As England and France moved into the age of enlightenment and revolution, they carried with them political cultures forged partly in the crucible of that earlier war. Concepts of sovereignty, representation, taxation, and military organization bore its imprint. The dispute that once revolved around the succession after Charles IV's death had faded into history. What remained was a changed Europe, one in which territorial states operated with clearer boundaries and stronger administrative frameworks. By the time Europe entered the modern age, the 100 Years' War existed less as a memory of battles and more as a foundation beneath political life. The arguments that began with Edward III's claim in 1337 had long since lost immediacy. Yet the structures forged during that struggle remained firmly in place. England and France now stood as mature sovereign states. Their rivalry continued across centuries in Europe, in colonies, at sea, but the medieval contest for a shared crown had ended permanently. What endured was the transformation that conflict had compelled. In France, centralized monarchy became a defining characteristic of governance. The fiscal reforms initiated to sustain prolonged warfare matured into permanent revenue systems. Standing armies became normalized. Administrative offices expanded, and loyalty increasingly flowed through bureaucratic channels rather than solely through personal feudal bonds. The authority of the crown, once contested by powerful regional lords, became more cohesive. Even during periods of internal unrest, the idea of a unified French kingdom under a single sovereign remained strong. That confidence drew in part from the experience of reconquest and recovery during the later phases of the war. In England, constitutional development followed its own trajectory. Parliamentary participation in taxation and legislation, strengthened during wartime negotiation, persisted. The monarchy remained powerful, yet it operated within a system increasingly defined by consultation and law. The 100 Years' War had helped entrench the expectation that large-scale mobilization required representative consent. Military organization across Europe reflected lessons learned during the long Anglo-French conflict. Infantry discipline, artillery integration, and logistical planning became essential components of warfare. Knights charging across open fields no longer defined battle. The era of gunpowder had begun in earnest. Fortification design across the continent evolved accordingly. Castles gave way to engineered defensive systems capable of resisting cannon fire. Military science became a field of study rather than an inherited art of nobility. Expertise joined lineage as a qualification for command. Economic development accelerated in the relative peace that followed the war's conclusion. Agricultural regions stabilized. Trade networks expanded. The Channel functioned as a commercial passage rather than a recurring invasion route. Ports once mobilized for war now facilitated exchange. Cultural identity solidified. In England, the vernacular language became firmly established in administration and literature. In France, the monarchy encouraged linguistic and legal uniformity. The separation of aristocratic estates across borders became permanent. Loyalties aligned with defined territories. Diplomacy matured into a system of balance rather than inheritance dispute. Treaties recognized sovereignty explicitly. Even when wars erupted in later centuries, they were framed within a European order that acknowledged separate states. The medieval ambiguity of overlapping claims faded. The 100 Years' War had also influenced social structure. Professional soldiers and administrators formed classes whose service extended beyond noble lineage. Governance required literacy, record-keeping, and financial expertise. The war's demands had elevated these skills. By the 18th and 19th centuries, historians looked back at the conflict as a turning point between medieval and early modern Europe. They identified its role in centralizing monarchy, fostering national identity, and modernizing military practice. While such interpretations simplify a complex era, they capture the breadth of change. The conflict had endured through plague, rebellion, reform, and technological innovation. It had begun with a question of succession and concluded with a redefinition of sovereignty. It had not delivered an English king to permanent rule in France, nor had it destroyed French monarchy. Instead, it reshaped both. Now, as the centuries quiet around us, the story slows. The armies have withdrawn. The banners that once marked contested fields have been folded away. Ports that launched fleets now rest under steady trade winds. The Channel, once crossed by invasion, carries only the sound of tide against stone. England and France continue their separate paths, shaped by what they endured. The claim to a shared crown fades into parchment and memory. What remains is the steady rhythm of governance courts convening, markets opening, ships departing at dawn. History rarely ends with silence. It settles gradually into structure. The 100 Years' War did the same. It reshaped institutions, clarified borders, and then receded into the background of daily life. You can almost imagine the fields where armies once stood, now quiet beneath evening light. The fortresses rebuilt, the towns restored, the crowns resting secure within their own realms. And as the tide moves gently between two shores that once fought so fiercely over inheritance, the long rivalry becomes part of a wider European story no longer urgent but never forgotten.